At the bottom of the map, Patagonia looks like empty space until the air starts moving. Here, gusts can tear across the plains at more than 160 kilometers per hour, hitting a human body like an invisible shove. And above that violence of wind, a different giant holds its breath, the southern Patagonia, ice field, an icy mass spreading roughly 13,000 square kilometers through the Andes. So, what kind of land is shaped by two forces that never rest: wind that never stops, and ice that never truly sleeps? And what happens when even the stable glaciers begin to change? Patagonia is not a single landscape. It is a collision zone between ocean and continent, between the Andes and the open plains, between moisture and drought. On the western side, the Pacific throws storm after storm into the mountains. On the eastern side, much of that moisture is wrung out and left behind, and the land opens into wide, dry steppe. The result is a region that can feel like two worlds stitched together by the same relentless wind. Above all of it sits the great remnant of an older planet, the Patagonian ice. The South Patagonian Ice Field still spans about 13,000 square kilometers, the largest temperate ice mass in the southern hemisphere outside Antarctica, a bright, heavy roof laid across the spine of the Andes. Storm systems from the southern Pacific can dump astonishing amounts of precipitation into these mountains, roughly 2 to 11 meters of rainfall per year, in places feeding the ice, rebuilding it even as its edges thin and retreat. That ice field is not just scenery. It is a factory. From its high plateau, dozens of outlet glaciers spill down in different directions, some toward Chile's fjords and channels, others into Argentina's immense glacial lakes. And wherever those glaciers have moved, they have rewritten the shape of the land, scraping valleys into broad U-shapes, polishing rock faces, dropping ridges of rubble, leaving behind turquoise water that looks painted its color, born from rock ground so fine it can float. Even the emptiest views in Patagonia are often crowded with invisible history. Every smooth valley wall, every over-deepened basin, every lake that seems too perfectly placed. But Patagonia is not only the story of ice. Beneath the carving is the construction. The Andes exist because tectonic forces have been lifting and compressing this edge of South America for millions of years. creating the steep relief that makes glaciers so powerful in the first place. In a place like Torres del Paine, that deeper story rises almost theatrically to the surface. The famous towers are not random spires. They are the exposed heart of an intrusive, complex magma that pushed upward into the crust and cooled into granite, later revealed by uplift and relentless erosion, especially glacial erosion. Some explanations describe the massif's creation through a laccolith-style intrusion, molten rock wedging into older layers, doming them upward, followed by the slow violence of ice and wind stripping away the softer material and leaving granite standing like a defiant skeleton. This is why Patagonia's geography feels so dramatic. It is built to be dramatic. The same forces that raised the Andes also created a staircase for glaciers to descend. And as the ice advanced and retreated through past cold periods, it sculpted corridors that today funnel air like a weapon. The wind is not merely strong here. It is engineered by topography, accelerated through gaps, amplified over open steppe, and intensified by the constant pressure differences of the far southern latitudes. In well-known trekking zones, such as Torres del Paine, travelers regularly encounter gusts reported around 160 km/h, a reminder that Patagonia's atmosphere is part of its geology. Look west from the mountains, and the landscape breaks into a labyrinth of water channels, fjords and islands, a coastline that seems shredded rather than drawn. These forms are the signature of ice meeting sea, where glaciers once pushed outward and then withdrew, leaving long, narrow inlets and steep walls that drop into cold, dark water. Look east, and the land flattens into a vast tawny plain, where shrubs crouch low, where distance feels endless, and where the horizon looks like it has been sanded smooth. Patagonia's emptiness is not absence, it is scale. It is the feeling of standing inside a wind tunnel the size of a country. And then there is the ice field. Again, quiet, bright, seemingly permanent. Yet science and observation keep pointing toward a modern tension. The ice is fed by storms, but it is also increasingly vulnerable to warming trends and shifting climate patterns. Patagonia's landscapes were made by imbalance, by ice advancing and collapsing by seas, rising and dropping by mountains, lifting and cracking. The unsettling question is whether the present era has become another turning point, not over millennia, but within a human lifetime. If wind and ice shaped Patagonia into what it is, what happens when the wind stays and the ice begins to hesitate? Patagonia's wildlife does not live despite the harshness. It lives because of it, because extremes simplify the rules. In many places, the land offers only a few ways to survive: graze low, move far, hide fast, or fly higher than the weather. The famous Patagonian emptiness is really a stripped-down stage where every actor matters and every absence changes the entire scene. On the open steppe of southern Argentina and Chile, two herbivores once formed a living foundation: the guanaco and Darwin's rhea. For generations, they were not just common animals. They were the main energy source feeding Patagonia's top hunters and scavengers. Conservation research describes them as historically central prey for pumas and even the soaring Andean condor, while their grazing helped shape how the grasslands look and function. When guanaco herds thin out, or rheas disappear from a valley, it is not a small change. It is the removal of a beam from a roof. Everything above it must shift to stay standing. The steppe itself is built for endurance. Plants grow low, tough, and sparse, as if the wind has trained them to keep secrets. Life follows seasonal pulses: fresh shoots after rare rains, sudden insect blooms, brief windows when newborns can afford to be vulnerable, and then the predators. A puma does not rule this land through noise. It rules through patience. In places like Torres del Paine, where protected habitat can allow wildlife to behave more naturally, park descriptions emphasize large populations of guanacos and pumas, with condors and hundreds of other bird species overhead. It is a reminder that Patagonia is not empty. It is simply wide enough to make even abundance look like solitude. There is also a quieter, almost tender detail that makes the steppe feel intimate: Darwin's rhea fathers. Conservation notes describe how males tend nests, where multiple females have laid eggs, and then raise the young, sometimes managing large, moving flocks of chicks. In a landscape often portrayed as ruthless, Patagonia hides these surprising reversals, moments where survival depends on care, not just strength. And that raises a question worth holding on to. If even the steppe contains this kind of delicate choreography, what else is happening beyond the horizon that the human eye keeps missing? Move west and south, and Patagonia changes personalities. The grasses and shrubs give way to forests that feel older than the language used to name them. In the far south, the Magellanic subpolar forests are often described as among the most southerly forests on Earth, a frontier where trees learn to live with cold wind and thin soils. These forests are defined by southern beaches, Nothophagus, and research summaries highlight key species like Nothophagus, Betuloides, N. Antarctica, and N. pumilio. The ecosystem is not rich in the tropical sense. It is not a jungle of endless variety. Instead, it is an ecosystem of resilience, forests, moorlands, and transitional zones stitched together across hard ecotones. This is where Patagonia's biodiversity becomes a story of boundaries. One ridge can separate wet air from dry air. One valley can shift from forest shade to sunburned steppe. One shore can flip the script entirely from terrestrial survival to marine spectacle. Along the Atlantic edge of Argentine Patagonia, the coastline hosts one of its most famous seasonal dramas, Magellanic penguins. At places like Punta Tombo, local reserve descriptions promote it as home to the world's largest Magellanic penguin colony. Even cautious summaries agree it is a major stronghold and a globally known nesting site. Penguins turn the ground itself into architecture-carving burrows, returning with astonishing fidelity and compressing the chaos of the ocean into a crowded strip of land. And then there is the wildlife that makes Patagonia feel like a living myth, the species that is present but never guaranteed. Few embody that better than the huemul, the South Andean deer widely recognized as endangered and increasingly fragmented into small, vulnerable subpopulations. It is not just an animal. It is a symbol of how quickly wildness can become thin. In the Patagonian imagination, the huemul is the kind of creature that turns an ordinary hike into a lifelong memory because it forces a person to admit something uncomfortable. Rarity is not romance. Rarity is warning. So Patagonia's land ecosystems form a chain step to forest, to mountain herbivore, to predator common species, to endangered relic. But Patagonia is not only a land story. Some of its richest biodiversity begins where the continent ends. Look into the water, and Patagonia becomes an entire second world. At Peninsula Valdez, a UNESCO World Heritage Site on the Atlantic coast, the geography creates calm gulfs sheltered from the rough sea conditions so protective that UNESCO highlights them as key areas for breeding, calving, and nursing of the southern right whale, alongside other marine mammals like elephant seals, sea lions, and orcas. Here, Patagonia is not an edge. It is a nursery. Farther south and west, the Chilean fjords and channels are often described as a marine labyrinth, cold water habitats that can include dolphins, sea lions, and whales depending on season and place. And within that coastal world, a different kind of foundation species holds everything together: giant kelp. Scientific work on kelp ecosystems emphasizes that kelps form habitat supporting complex food webs and highlights Macrocystis porifera as a widely distributed habitat-forming species that provides essential ecosystem services. Patagonia's kelp forests are not just underwater plants. They are living infrastructure, shelter, nursery, food source, and coastline protection in one. But even Patagonia's underwater forests are not invincible. Recent research assessing marine stressors in Chilean Patagonia indicates that ocean temperature change is a major stressor for giant kelp forest habitats, with warming events posing serious threats to ecosystem persistence. The pattern echoes the land. A world shaped by extremes is resilient until the extremes change direction. This is the deeper truth of Patagonian biodiversity. It is not merely beautiful. It is interlocked. Guanacos and rheas feed pumas and condors. Forests stand where moisture survives the wind. Penguins depend on safe nesting and healthy seas. Whales depend on quiet calving waters. Kelp depends on temperatures that do not cross invisible thresholds too often. And that leads to the uncomfortable question Patagonia always asks, even when the camera is steady and the landscape looks eternal, if this place is a network of relationships, not isolated wonders. What breaks first when pressure arrives? Patagonia's first human story is not about conquest. It is about arrival. And the question that follows every arrival, what does a person become when the land refuses to be tamed? Long before national borders split this region into Chile and Argentina, Patagonia was already a mosaic of homelands routes, seasonal camps, and languages shaped by water, wind, and the migration of animals. One of the most important clues to that deep timeline sits far north of the end of the world in southern Chile, Monteverde. The site is widely discussed because it shows humans were living in the Americas well before the old Clovis first idea, dating to roughly 14,500 calibrated years BP, with early radiocarbon dates often referenced around 14,800 BP. Monteverde matters here, not because it is Patagonia proper, but because it changes the emotional scale of the story. It means the southern landscapes were not an afterthought. People were already moving, adapting, and building lives in the far reaches of the continent, while ice still dominated many latitudes. So the question becomes sharper. If human presence in the South is ancient, what forms of intelligence did Patagonia demand? What kind of knowledge survives when written maps do not exist? When the only navigation is weather animal tracks and the memory of water? Across eastern Patagonia, the Tehuelche, also known as the Aonikink, are often described as indigenous peoples historically associated with the region's open plains and seasonal mobility. Their traditional life has been documented as hunter-gatherer, moving with the seasons following herds, reading the land the way sailors read the sea. Sources describe diets centered largely on guanaco and rhea, supplemented by plant foods with no agriculture in the classic sense. That detail is more than a footnote. It explains why movement was not simply a choice, it was a survival strategy. When food walks, people must learn to walk with it. Imagine the steppe through that lens. The horizon is not empty. It is a pantry that moves. The wind is not bad weather. It is a messenger warning of storms guiding scent, erasing footprints, reshaping the day. In such a world, the most valuable technology is not metal. It is attention. And the most important calendar is not written. It is embodied the season when guanaco herds concentrate, when water holes shrink, when certain plants offer brief nourishment, when cold makes mistakes lethal. But even this is only one Patagonia. Because in the far south and west, Patagonia becomes water, and the human story changes with it. In the fjords and channels of Chilean Patagonia, another people's history reads like a maritime epic, the Kaweskar. Some accounts describe their territory as a wilderness that has been continually traversed for at least 6,000 years by canoe-faring hunter-gatherer nomads. And academic reporting explains how they traveled the fjords and channels in canoes, sometimes made of animal hide, to hunt fish and harvest, spending so much of life on the water that even social patterns were shaped by distance and rarity of encounter. This is one of Patagonia's most breathtaking reversals. While outsiders see the region as a land at the edge, the Kaweskar world was in many ways an aquatic homeland. The sea was not a barrier. It was a road system. The islands were not obstacles. They were stepping stones. The cold was not a tragedy. It was a condition of belonging. In a documentary lens, this is where Patagonia stops being a postcard and becomes a philosophy, because a seafaring life in that climate suggests an ethic: take only what the day can carry. Learn the moods of tide and wind. Read shelter in a coastline's curve. Treat a camp as temporary, because the world itself is temporary. And then there is a deeper tension. That long continuity, thousands of years of movement knowledge in place, collides with a much shorter timeline of contact and displacement. Even when the documentary voice stays calm, the history underneath is often not calm at all. Across the far south, several Fijian peoples, among them the Selknam, often associated with the interior of Tierra del Fuego, the Yagan, the Kaweskar, and the Haush, experienced catastrophic disruption in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. One recent overview describes patterns of kidnapping, degrading human exhibitions in Europe, disease abuse, and the lasting wound of remains held in foreign museums alongside the violence and dispossession tied to the colonial expansion of ranching and settlement. That kind of history risks turning Patagonia into a place where suffering becomes spectacle. Irresponsible documentary does the opposite. It makes the viewer feel the cost of turning people into background, and it asks whether modern admiration for wild places can ever be separated from the human stories that were pushed aside to create that illusion. So Patagonia's early cultures are not just color. They are the region's first and most profound survival science knowledge systems tuned to wind corridors, sea channels, animal behavior, and the subtle timing of seasons. But there is still another Patagonia to name the interior of Tierra del Fuego, where the world is colder, flatter, and more isolated, where even the sea can feel like a wall. The Selknam, also known as the Ona, are commonly described as nomadic people who relied heavily on hunting for survival, with accounts emphasizing guanaco as a major part of the traditional diet and material life food hide shelter and tools adapted for a harsh southern climate. They are often contrasted with seafaring Fuegian groups because their traditional life is associated more with the island's interior than with constant travel by canoe. That contrast matters because it proves something essential. Patagonia never had just one way of living. Even within the same latitude, the environment creates different solutions. Some cultures moved through water mazes. Others read the grass in the sky. Some relied on marine harvest. Others centered a land animal strong enough to be the backbone of an entire society. And now, the documentary must ask its hardest questions quietly, without accusation, but with clarity. When settlers and industries arrived, what did they see? A homeland or a resource, a culture or an obstacle? And when a people's identity is built on movement, what happens when movement is restricted, fenced, renamed, or punished? The history of Patagonia's indigenous peoples cannot be told as a simple before and after. The past is still present in language revitalization efforts, in legal recognition battles, in memory projects, and in the names that refuse to disappear. Even the landscape carries those echoes. A valley that tourists cross in a day may have been a seasonal route for generations. A sheltered bay filmed for cinematic calm may have been a corridor of livelihood. And the wind, always, the wind, has been the same teacher for everyone who ever tried to live here. So, this chapter of Patagonia is not just about early settlement. It is about relationship between humans and animals humans, and water humans, and weather, and humans, and the stories they choose to keep. Because Patagonia's most enduring mystery is not why the land is harsh. The mystery is why people stayed, why they returned, why they made culture out of instability. And that leads to the next turning point. When outsiders arrived with maps, flags, and promises, how did Patagonia change when it became a destination for explorers, empires, and industries? Patagonia's history of exploration begins the way many edge-of-the-world stories begin, not with footsteps, but with water-cold water, dangerous water that promised a shortcut and delivered a test. For European navigators, the southern tip of South America was a puzzle with teeth. The Atlantic and the Pacific existed like two locked rooms, and the key, if it existed, would have to be carved out of storms, currents, and rock. When Ferdinand Magellan's expedition finally entered what would become known as the Strait of Magellan, it happened on All Saints' Day, 1st November 1520, and the passage itself was treacherous enough that it took weeks to thread through. Another account notes, it took 38 days to navigate the strait before reaching the open Pacific. The strait did not just change a map, it changed the meaning of Patagonia. A place that indigenous peoples had known through seasons roots and lived experience was reframed as a corridor, an object to be crossed, claimed, and renamed. In that reframing, the land becomes remote by definition because it is measured from the outside in. And yet this is one of Patagonia's enduring contradictions. The more outsiders tried to reduce it to a passage, the more Patagonia resisted being simplified. The strait was not an easy key. It was a gauntlet. Ships did not glide through. They endured. Coastlines did not guide. They confused. Weather did not decorate the journey. It threatened to erase it. This is where the documentary's tone must slow down and pay attention. Because exploration here was never only about bravery. It was about vulnerability, about how small a vessel becomes when the sky decides to move. So, a question hangs over the earliest chapters. When explorers looked at Patagonia, were they truly seeing a land? Or were they only seeing a route that led somewhere else? Over time, Patagonia stopped being only a line on a navigator's dream and became a stage for something more permanent: settlement sovereignty and the building of towns that could hold the edge of the continent. On the Chilean side of the strait, one city tells that story with brutal clarity: Punta Arenas. It was established by the Chilean government in 1848, originally as a penal colony, in part to assert control over the Strait of Magellan. The logic is chilling in its simplicity. If a border feels uncertain, put bodies there: guards, prisoners, workers, families. And the uncertainty becomes a street, a dock, a ledger. Then economics arrived, and the outpost grew teeth of its own. Punta Arenas expanded as maritime traffic increased, and it became a magnet during waves of immigration. The city's growth is also linked to a gold rush and a sheep farming boom in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, turning Patagonia into an engine of wool land ownership and new wealth. This is one of the defining pivots of Patagonia's historical development: the transition from a place endured to a place exploited, sometimes carefully, often aggressively. Sheep ranching in particular reshaped huge areas of steppe into a working landscape. Fences appear, routes change. The steppe's ancient openness becomes segmented. In a wide land, lines begin to multiply. The documentary camera, if it lingers, will notice the way these developments echo across distance. A port city is never just a city. It is a portal that pulls the interior into the world economy. A boom is never only an opportunity. It is also an invitation to overreach. So the next question becomes unavoidable. When Patagonia begins to pay, who pays the price, and who gets to decide what the land is for? Across the Andes and into Argentina's Patagonian interior, another migration story unfolds: one that carries a different kind of ambition, cultural survival. In 1865, Welsh settlers established what is known as wildest, a Welsh colony in Argentine Patagonia, mainly along the lower Chubut Valley. It is easy to summarize this as a curiosity Welsh language and tea houses at the end of the world. But that misses the deeper truth. This was a deliberate attempt to build a community far from the pressures that threatened their identity. But Patagonia is not sentimental. It tests every ideal with wind distance and dry soil. In the Chubut region, survival depended on learning Patagonia's real language water management seasons and the stubborn patience required to coax life out of aridity. Settlements like Gaiman-Trelieu and Dalavan became anchors for a community that had to adapt without dissolving. The story is not only about immigrants taming a landscape. It is also about a landscape reshaping the people who arrived with plans and expectations. Here, Patagonia's history becomes layered: indigenous homelands, colonial roots, nation-building projects, immigrant experiments, and the hard arithmetic of what can survive. And the Welsh story carries a wider lesson, for the documentary's arc Patagonia is not a blank page. Every group that arrives ends up writing with the same ink scarcity weather and the constant negotiation between hope and reality. So another question rises: can a culture protect itself by fleeing to the edge of the world? Or does the edge simply demand a new version of that culture? If Punta Arenas and the Chubut Valley represent settlement and industry, Patagonia's southernmost urban myth is built from a darker tool confinement. In Ushuaia, the idea of a prison was used as a strategy to occupy and secure territory. One account describes how Argentine officials saw a prison as a way to obtain labor and strengthen presence in a contested frontier, an approach modeled on other global penal colonies. The prison's construction began in the early 1900s. One source notes construction in 1903, and the structure was designed in multiple pavilions, arranged to make surveillance easier. This is not just an eerie footnote. It is a reminder that development at the edge can be built from coercion as much as from dreams. In harsh places, institutions often arrive wearing the costume of necessity. And yet Patagonia is always two stories at once. The same region that is used for penal logic also becomes a birthplace of modern conservation ideas. Argentina's Los Glaciares National Park was established in 1937, protecting a landscape fed by the South Patagonian Ice Field, and famous for glaciers calving into Lake Argentino. UNESCO's description highlights major glaciers within the park, including the striking Perito Moreno Glacier, known for dramatic ruptures and calving events. So, Patagonia's historical development swings between extremes extraction and protection occupation, and awe fences and wilderness. And that tension sets up the modern chapter perfectly. Because once a place becomes iconic, once it becomes the end of the world for tourists, photographers, and bucket lists, the pressure changes shape. It is no longer only gold wool or geopolitical control. It becomes attention. It becomes crowds. It becomes climate. If Patagonia was once the place humans came to test their limits, what happens when Patagonia itself is the one being tested? Modern Patagonia lives inside a paradox. It is marketed as untouched, yet it is now touched by more forces than ever: warming air, shifting precipitation, expanding tourism, and the global hunger for wilderness as an experience. The landscape still looks eternal on camera, but the measurements tell a different story. Across the Patagonian Andes, glaciers have been losing mass at a striking pace for decades. A 2025 study in Nature Communications reports Patagonian glacier mass loss on the order of about 24 gigatons per year over 1979, 20, and 23, tying the trend to large-scale atmospheric circulation patterns that are shifting poleward. Other glaciology research also describes rapid volume loss in the Patagonian ice fields, emphasizing that these ice masses are shrinking fast, even if the exact distribution of loss varies by basin. And then there is the glacier that became famous precisely because it seemed to resist the trend Perito Moreno. For years, it was often described as stable compared with neighboring glaciers until stability began to crack. Reporting in 2025 describes how the glacier stopped returning to its previous position starting in 2022, with the pattern repeating in 2023, 2024, and 2025 as thinning and retreat continued. A 2025 research article in Communications Earth and Environment focuses on why the glacier's behavior is changing, noting that its frontal position and elevation were relatively steady until recently, and that subglacial topography plays a major role in whether a lake-terminating glacier holds or collapses. Another 2025 write-up summarizing that work describes a dramatic acceleration thinning near the terminus, increasing many-fold, and retreat reaching hundreds of meters in some areas since 2019. For a documentary, this is not just bad news, it is a narrative hinge. Because Patagonia is famous for clean lines, sharp peaks, hard wind, bright ice. When the ice changes, the entire identity of the place feels less certain. The question stops being, is Patagonia wild? And becomes, what does wildness mean when the baseline itself is moving? At the same time, Patagonia's human rhythm has accelerated, especially through tourism. In Chile's Torres del Paine, visitor pressure is no longer a background detail. It is part of the ecosystem. Recent reporting cites more than 367,000 visitors in 2024, attributing the figure to Chile's National Forestry Agency, CONAF. A local tourism industry source cites 920 visitors in 2023. And travel media frequently places Torres del Paine in the 250,000 plus annual visitors range, underscoring how consistently popular the park has become. Popularity brings money and jobs, especially to gateway towns like Puerto Natales. But it also brings erosion, waste crowding, and rescue logistics in terrain that does not forgive mistakes. Trail managers and conservation groups emphasize the need for sustainable trail design that prevents braiding, flooding, and habitat damage. Some operators and partner organizations have worked on reconstruction efforts specifically to combat erosion and make heavily used routes safer. Then Patagonia reminds everyone that it is not a theme park. In late 2025, a blizzard in the Torres del Paine area killed several foreign tourists with reports describing extreme winds and harsh conditions that complicated rescues. This is the modern Patagonia dilemma. In one sharp image, more people are arriving, while the weather can still turn a famous trail into a survival situation. So, the documentary's modern chapter should not frame tourism as good or bad. It should frame it as a responsibility problem. The more Patagonia becomes a dream destination, the more its safety and ecosystems depend on choices, visitor behavior, park management, and infrastructure that protects fragile ground without turning wilderness into a sidewalk. And yet, Patagonia is not only a story of loss and pressure, it is also a story of an unusually ambitious conservation response, rewilding and corridor building at a continental scale. In recent years, Chile's protected areas have been reshaped by major land donations and national park expansions tied to conservation organizations associated with Douglas and Christine Tompkins. One project summary describes how a former livestock ranch was restored and then donated to the Chilean state in 2018 as part of a broader push that also created and expanded other parks. Reporting has described this as a historic conservation act, with Chile creating multiple parks and expanding others through a combination of private donation and state land. That momentum is still unfolding. In December 2025, major outlets reported Chile's plans to establish Cape Froward National Park, a move intended to protect a vast coastal wilderness and strengthen a long Patagonian conservation corridor, while also requiring indigenous consultation in the process. This is modern Patagonia's quieter revolution, not just preserving postcard icons, but knitting landscapes together so wildlife and ecosystems have room to breathe. Culturally, Patagonia's towns and communities now live at the intersection of tradition and the new wilderness economy. Ranching identity still shapes much of the region's imagery and local life, while guiding hospitality and conservation work have become modern livelihoods. Indigenous heritage, long treated as a footnote by outsiders, increasingly sits at the center of debates about land recognition and what protection should mean when people have lived with these landscapes for thousands of years. So the modern Patagonia chapter ends on a knife-edge ice-thinning visitor numbers, rising weather turning deadly without warning, and at the same time, parks expanding corridors forming, and a new conservation imagination trying to outrun the damage. In a place defined by wind and ice, the defining question may no longer be, how far can humans go? It may be, how carefully can humans stay? Patagonia is often sold as a place beyond time, a final frontier where the world still looks the way it did before humans learned to count everything. But the truth is more complicated and more urgent. This land was shaped by forces that work on geological scales: mountains, rising glaciers, carving oceans, reshaping coastlines. And yet now, some of the most visible changes are happening fast enough to be noticed within a single generation. Ice fields thinning famous glaciers, behaving differently, and the stable rhythms of cold places becoming harder to trust. At the same time, Patagonia has become a mirror for modern desire. The more the world feels crowded and loud, the more people chase silence, wide horizons, clean air, a sense of being small in a big universe. But when that desire arrives in large numbers, wilderness can start to wear down under the weight of admiration. Torres del Paine's popularity and the dangers that can emerge when weather turns shows how quickly awe can turn into risk, and how urgently this region needs respect, not just visitors. And still, Patagonia is not only a warning, it is also one of the rare places where the world has attempted conservation at a scale that matches the landscape building corridors, expanding protected areas, and trying to protect not only iconic viewpoints, but entire living systems. That effort carries a message as powerful as any peak or glacier change is not inevitable in only one direction. Loss is not the only story humans can write. So what does Patagonia ask from the viewer? Someone who may never step onto its trails, never feel its wind, never hear the crack of calving ice. It asks for a different kind of relationship, Learn the human histories, especially the indigenous histories that existed long before Patagonia became a brand. Travel with restraint. Choose operators who reduce impact, follow trail rules, respect closures, and treat weather warnings like law. Support conservation work that protects ecosystems as connected networks, not isolated postcard icons. And share what you learn, because awareness is the first form of protection. On the map, Patagonia is drawn as an edge. But in reality, it is a question carved into rock carried by wind and answered by what humans choose to value next.